his time as of his parents, you know, who have your background. But, you know, I mean, I'm very, very different from the way my parents were. My children are very small, so, you know, we'll see where that goes, but I imagine it'll be very, very different from me. Yeah.
I was just going to say, just kind of connecting to what Dr. Bean said, and at the same time talking about the spirit of the age. One analogy I've heard, of course, in our church, we use the imagery of the divine spark or the sacred flame, you know, as something for that spirit. But the image of a flame in a lantern, like an old lantern, you can take it as the different panes or apertures. And if you have, you know, if each of these, of course, are a different color, you know, you have it shining on the wall, and when the light passes through the particular thing, it takes on the characteristics of that which it passes through. So you've got, you know, you have a red light on the wall, you have a blue light on the wall, but of course the underlying thing, you go further back, and it's the, you know, it's the same thing, which is, you know, colorless. If you smash one of those, you know, and the light instead passes through a different thing, are we talking about the same? Is it the same light, or is it a different light? It's the same light, but it's differentiated because of all these other things that it takes on because of its circumstance. But that's not what it is. And if we were to kind of personify this light that passes through these things, if these strands or beams of light were people, for example, if one looked at the other, it would, after a fashion, see itself, even though it wouldn't recognize it necessarily, because of those pains. And if it turned around and looked back towards whence it came, it would also see itself. So there's, if that makes any sense.
Well, you could go further with it. You could say, let's say you're the red glass, and let's say you're looking at the blue glass. You're not going to see the blue glass. You're going to see a purple glass. You're not going to see that person as he or she is. You're going to see some mixture of, you know, you're not going to see, it's not going to look the same to you as the yellow glass does.
It's
So
that bit about not seeing things as they are, but as we are.
Yeah. Or some combination.
Yeah.
Some combination. We could take a little bit more esoteric a turn on this. You could argue or suggest that the numbers of facets on this lamp is 12. And it is curious how the 12 kind of keep appearing, not only in, for example, astrology. There are lots of different kinds of astrology. Like Chinese astrology bears no real resemblance to Western astrology, except that it has a system of 12. You know, you've all read the mats in the Chinese restaurant, you know, whether you're a monkey or a dog or a pig, whatever it is, you know, I do. It's a completely different system, and yet it's a system of 12. And you could say the signs of the zodiac. Let's just see them in the light of the Western system, just for the sake of simplicity. You know, is this kind of basic series of glasses through which this light projects itself and is seen. And this gets kind of interesting because, well, we've already discovered that seeing through this particular lens distorts things. And you could say, again, radically simplifying to the point of being simplistic, you could say that the sign that you, your sun sign, is sort of this lens that you see through. You know, you're always seeing through the blue. You're always seeing through the lens of Scorpio or Aquarius or whatever, which inevitably distorts things. And that distortion is kind of, in a weird sort of way, could be viewed as a kind of betrayal. You know, it serves you in a certain sense, but it serves you badly in another sense. It's a bit treacherous. Well, that's funny. Because this motif of 12, and you can see it in the book of Genesis with Joseph and his brothers, and you start to see it in the Gospels with Christ and the disciples, I suppose you could see it in Arthur and the Round Table if you assume that there were 12 knights of the Round Table. I'm sure there's someone here who's much more up on Arthurian things than I did, so I won't go much further down the path. But this 12 is always associated with betrayal. Either it's betrayed like Joseph, or it's the betrayer like Judas or Lancelot. So, I guess what I'm saying is Judas is your son. It's always going to betray you.
Just to take another example of that, if you look at the 12 gates of the New Jerusalem in Revelation, you can only pass through one of them.
That's one of them. Yeah, there, of course, the whole idea in Revelation, the symbolism of Revelation is like a redeemed state of all of these things. It's not, kind of the kind of defective current state of things that we're all unfortunately used to. Yeah. I mean, it's that's very good. That's very good. I know of an esoteric school in England that divided different types of esoteric work into 12, by analogy, the gates of the city, which I thought was interesting. So this betrays you. If you're a Scorpio, you might tend to see hidden motives where they don't exist sometimes. If you're a Gemini, I mean, again, you'd stereotypically. You might just see the surfaces of things without seeing the depths, and so on and so on. I mean, again, you all know, the astrological types is simplistically presented. So this essence, that's kind of coming through these lamps, does get distorted, and some way or another, you just have to factor that in. Are you ever really going to get past it? Well, no, probably not, but at the very least, it probably leads to a little bit of humility about, what I've seen. My picture of the red glass as being purple may never really radically change. But on the other hand, the blue as purple, that's not quite the whole picture. That might not how it is in reality. So I guess the lesson, if nothing else, is a certain kind of humility and taking things in perspective. The trap, there's always a trap, is relativism, and this is kind of the trap of our age, which is relativism. Suddenly, we all lived through it, or lived through the aftermath of it. Particularly in the 60s, people started to realize that a lot of things that were considered good or moral were merely conventions, including, as it turned out, sexual morality. So a lot of that was jettisoned, and now, a couple can rent an apartment together without being married, which might have been very difficult. I'm not talking about a heterosexual couple, which would have been very difficult 50 or 60 years ago in a lot of places. The downside of it was that all morality was somehow lumped in with this, and people became very contemptuous of even core values as a result. And I think this has caused problems in society. And again, we can have an elaborate discussion on just what those are and how far they've gone, but it would be very useful. So that was interesting. Any other comments? Mm-hmm.
I see like the journey in here too, like the incarnation from spirit to body, and then the ascension to body and spirit, and then the Pentecostal aspect of coming back, to body, and being that this is an eternal, we're always all of them at all the same time. Like that could happen over a lifetime or in a minute. Like you could go from one state of experience and then suck yourself into the eye, and then learn something or not, and come back and be like, I learned something or didn't, and share with the rest. And I also kind of see this Trinitarian kind of aspect in here too, where there's the ineffable, the kind of defined, and then the common community that is the expression of the ineffable. And So I'm sorry, I'm just kind of going down a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah, so.
Well, in a way, of course, all experience is ineffable beyond a certain point. Let's take taste of beets. I don't particularly care for beets, as a matter of fact. I certainly avoid eating them whenever I possibly can. Other people like beets, eat them perfectly happily. So am I tasting the same thing that they are? You could say that that experience, even something as mundane as that, is ineffable. Obviously not, if it's, I have a friend who hates cheese. Is he tasting the same thing when he tastes cheese that I do? Evidently not, because I love cheese. It's always, I mean, the trap there is to go to radical conceptualization, to categorizing, to thinking things out. And the other is, of course, aphasia, where you can't just say anything at all. That's another trap. I mean, there's a point, I would say, probably, at which you do have an experience that's ineffable, and you're not really going to say anything about it, and you can't. William James, in his Varieties of Religious Experience, in fact, had one of the 4 characteristics of religious experience as ineffability. What does that mean? Well, it means there's not words in any language that really quite describe it. Maybe, and the reason for that, well, words are really designed to piece the world apart, to take the world apart and enable us to categorize it. This is a podium. The fact that it's a podium means it's not a dry erase marker. These terms are only meaningful if you're making some kind of distinction. But if you're having some kind of experience where distinction becomes meaningless or starts to look much more transparent, well, then it becomes ineffable, because language wasn't really designed to do that. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, talking about that commonness of the spirit with everyone reminds me of, I was up surfing the net late one night and ran across an English mystic, Douglas Harding. Oh yeah, he has this whole website. Well, he died a few years ago. It's called The Headless Way, and he has a really simple exercise that is one of his first things. It's simply put your attention where your finger's pointing, and you notice that that's the sense of other. That's the sense of other. You get closer to the body, and there's the sense of self. But your foot isn't yourself. But if you point here and put your attention there, there's a way in which where you point, and if you put your attention there, there's this emptiness behind you that you seem to arise out of. But everybody has that same thing that they arise out of, which I thought was very clever. He went around the world lecturing on religion, and people would say, well, what are you lecturing on? He says, well, it's easier for me to show you than to tell you.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's very useful.
And that is very similar to the Buddhist Prajnaparamita meditation, where you're looking for the self where it arises out of, but you can't find it.
Yeah, because it's always that.
Yeah.
Which is looking to find it. That's... well, to me that raises an interesting question, like, where is the I? Where is the I in us? And again, you could come up with all sorts of complex metaphysical answers. It is curious, as that exercise seems to suggest, that we experience the I somewhere kind of like an inch or two behind the eyes or behind the forehead. That is probably where I, most of the time. In fact, once I had, this was kind of a fairly intense retreat, had a sense of the I being kind of in the gut, the Dantian area, or whatever you want to call it. It was odd. It was really odd. It didn't last very long.
Sort of a Japanese sense of it.
Right.
The hara.
Yeah, hara, that's the same thing. There's a funny story that Jung told when he was touring the southwestern U.S. And he said he met this chief of the Pueblo Indians who kind of said to me, these white people are very, very funny. They experience themselves, they think they're in their heads. And Jung sort of laughed and said, well, where do you experience yourself? Pointed here. And luckily for you, I will not launch into a series of moralizing sermons about the superiority of the heart to the head and how wonderful the heart is and how we should all be nice heart people and all that kind of thing. Because I don't know very much about you, but I think I know enough about you to know that you probably heard enough of that in your time.
It's also best if His Grace doesn't start projectile vomiting during. Thanks for that, I appreciate it.
I do think it's an interesting question, kind of, historically, like, was there a time when people actually felt themselves down there much more than they do now, and what does that mean? Go back to Aristotle. Aristotle thought that the heart was the center of thought, and the brain was just like an organ for cooling the body. Not everybody agreed with it, but if you could think, if the heart is often portrayed as an organ of thought.
The Chinese saw the brain as just a secondary organ, not even an essential one.
And yet by
all too true.
And yet by Descartes, he is identifying the pineal gland as the nexus of the soul and the body. So he's already very much thinking of it right up there.
Well, it's interesting because the pineal gland is, of course, thought as the third eye, and I guess there is some evidence that vestigally from various evolutionary developments, it is kind of a third eye and is sensitive to light. In certain lizards or whatever, they actually have a third eye that's equivalent to our pineal. That's actually, a light perceiving organ. I always wondered where Descartes got that idea. There's all sorts of ideas that Descartes was a Rosicrucian, or that funny story about Descartes. He went to Central Europe to look for the Rosicrucians, apparently, and he got caught there in 30 Years' War. He never found them, but he did come up with all of his elaborate theories while he was hanging around. And there was this rumor that he was a Rosicrucian, and there was a rumor that the Rosicrucians were invisible. So when he went back to Paris, he sort of said, I can't be a Rosicrucian because here you can see me. That's another train of thought. So, any other thoughts or questions? We can open this up to any sort of more or less relevant things. I'm not going to be very good at giving you stock tips or advice on how to fix your plumbing. But, yeah.
Can you relate salvation to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. What is salvation? Well, let's take the popular view of it. And the popular view of salvation is pretty much oriented toward the afterlife. The idea is that you're at least potentially in danger of hell, and salvation is a kind of, shall we say, insurance policy that will keep you from that. Levi-Strauss, the great French anthropologist, when he was in the Amazon, he said he ran into these American missionaries, and he said they had this really odd quality. They were like people who bought an insurance policy and were trying to sell them to others now. And that's, if you wanted a one anecdote summary of the American religion, that would be one. But it is explicitly some kind of promise of help in the afterlife. And this kind of goes back to enormous numbers of traditions that say, that your position in the afterlife is, one, going to be based on your moral compass and your moral development and your moral behavior in life. And two, that even so, you might need some kind of supernal help at the moment of death to kind of get past whatever hurdles there are. This is very much contrary to the near-death experience, which is very often, like in our culture, portrayed as beatific. And how do you relate the two? I don't know. I mean, a near-death experience is, of course, not a death experience. So, how similar is it critical?
Which raises the interesting question: why aren't there any near-death experiences of inferno?
Well, there are.
There are some.
There was one, for example.
People want to get accomplished anyway.
Howard Storm, who's the author of a book called My Descent into Death. He, to put his story briefly, he was vacationing in Paris. He got some kind of brain ailment, and he was pretty soon near death. And his experience of it was that he was descending, and these devils were sort of pulling at him. And he was an atheist in his life. These devils were pulling at him, and he, suddenly got the presence of mind to start praying. And he said his prayers were like, because he was an atheist, his prayers were really, incoherent. They were sort of like some combination of the Lord's Prayer and the Pledge of Allegiance and various. You can remember in that rather dire state. And, he had this experience, I think, of Christ coming and saving him. So there is some experience of that.
Did he stay an atheist afterwards?
Excuse me?
Did he remain an atheist after returning to life?
No, he became a disciple of Christ's minister.
Huh. That's an interesting, I had heard that he'd become a UCC minister, but maybe not. One of those of Christ churches. It's kind of interesting. It's a different take on it if he ends up as one and then the other.
I just can observe that the first 15 minutes you spent at the dentist's office seemed quite pleasant as well.
Oh, just
The first 15 minutes you spend in the dentist's office can seem quite pleasant. There's some nice magazines, the music's quite calming, there's some potted plants. It's only after the first 15 minutes things get interesting.
Then you have the salvation of gas.
Right. It's funny. I'm sorry.
That is interesting, yeah. That's curious. I never thought of that. I like that.
I always, whenever the question of salvation or saving comes up, I always think of all places, a passage from Heidegger's essay on technology, where he says that to save something is not merely to snatch it from danger. And the sort of traditional sense is to snatch something from danger. Christ comes and saves us from the fires of hell. He says to save something is to set it free into its own essence.
Well, that's also very Kierkegaardian as well.
Yeah, right. That salvation is being empowered in some way, or having a space opened up in which you can become what you are. And I find that very, very striking.
In the first place, I want to say how impressed I am that you managed to get a statement that clear out of Heidegger.
It's an occupational hazard.
Yeah.
It's just my job.
All those.
Also, it's interesting that as a psychotherapist, you're defining my job as salvation.
But absolutely, yeah. To set something free into its own essence.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a good description of psychotherapy.
Yeah. Wow.
So in this coming sort of becoming free and becoming kind of liberated, coming into its own essence from all of its attachments to the impulses of the body, which the esoteric tradition, Christianity is often called passions, pathe in Greek, which has the same root meaning, or the images and thoughts in the mind. I think, my own view, which some of you are familiar with in my book, I think yeah, it is possible and arguable that, and I believe it's so, that it is possible to ask for help and salvation in the afterlife from whatever dangers, whether you picture them as, in terms of the Inferno or the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I think it's possible to ask for help and since receive some reassurance of it. That's the conventional Christian view. Unfortunately, it doesn't really do much beyond that. What are you going to do when you're saved? And I think it's a question they often have because, it's like repeating the third grade over again or something like that. You have this, well, I repented and I'm saved. Well, I guess just do that again. And you go on and on. You're beating your head on the floor because, you're a sinner in a way because that's all you know how to do. Classic cases of that are in Dostoevsky novels, for hundreds of pages. The Russians, for some reason, seem to be really into this.
Speaking of the salvation aspect, the body, this lower level, existing at the intersection of time and space, which the other ones do not. Would you find that the crucifix to be a symbol of being attached, and the suffering that comes from being attached to that world of time and space and the sensational world, and that the salvation is just getting off the cross, basically, and moving on away from that?
Yeah. It's sort of unfortunately a one-word answer, but to give an answer that's maybe at least a little potentially more entertaining. I personally am very impressed by A Course in Miracles. People, I'm sure, many of you are familiar with it. I'm sure there are lots of different opinions you may have about it, and we can go into that not as each other. But one thing that does impress me about it is a statement that says at some point, it says, "Do not make the pathetic mistake of clinging to the old rugged cross. The only lesson of the cross is that you can overcome the cross." And I think that's one aspect of, one corollary you could draw from what you just said. The Son of God comes down to earth. He's born in, frankly, rather humiliating circumstances. He grows up, he has friends and enemies, he sort of does his thing in the world. And he's crucified on the cross of time and space. But somehow that doesn't really matter, because what's true about him is immortal and he comes back in a new glorified form. I would say one difference between esoteric Christianity and conventional Christianity is that conventional Christianity would say that that's true of Jesus, and at least the form of esoteric Christianity I'm approaching is saying that it's true of all of us. And that in one sense the Passion of Christ is not some kind of vicarious atonement, but sort of a symbolic reenactment of what we all go through. Rudolf Steiner, as you may know, said that the cross, the crucifixion, although it really did happen, was an enactment of the very same ritual that used to take place in the Egyptian mysteries. True or not, that was what he said. So yeah, I think that is the case. I mean, another thing that strikes me is relevant to that is all of this stuff about the nature of Christ in the early centuries of Christianity. These elaborate arguments, these elaborate distinctions, same substance of similar substance. Was he? How many persons are there? Is it like one kind of mixed up person or two persons? Whatever. The whole argument and how it all came out.